The morning started the way most mornings did at Kensington Palace, quietly, deliberately, with a kind of polished stillness that the outside world never got to see. The gardens were still damp from the night before. The stone paths glistened, which the staff had been moving through their routines since before the sun fully cleared the tree-line, pressing linens, preparing breakfast trays, checking schedules, running through the day's itinerary with the kind of focused efficiency that came from years of service to the crown. Everything was in its place. Everything ran on time. That was the way it always was, and that was the way everyone inside those walls expected it to remain. But Charlotte was already awake before any of them knocked on her door. I think she hadn't slept well. That, wasn't unusual for her lately, though she would never have admitted it out loud, not to her mother, not to her father, and certainly not to any member of the household staff who might carry the wrong impression of her to the wrong person. She, in my opinion, was 10 years old, nearly 11, and she had already learned, without anyone sitting her down to teach her, that showing weakness inside a palace was a complicated thing. Not because the people around her were cruel. They weren't. But because basically, the moment you let something slip, even something small, it had a way of becoming a conversation, and conversations had a way of becoming concerns, and concerns had a way of becoming decisions made about you rather than with you. Charlotte was old enough to understand that dynamic even if she couldn't have named it. So she kept things quiet. She dressed herself before her aide arrived. She brushed her own hair, pulled it back the way her mother had shown her, and sat by the window in her room, in my opinion, looking out at the garden with her knees pulled up to her chest and her chin resting on top of them. She watched a blackbird hop across the wet grass, stop, tilt its head, and then disappear into the hedgerow. She thought about nothing in particular, and then she thought about everything at once. Which was a habit she had developed and not yet found a way to break. Today was going to be different from the usual schedule. There, to be fair, was an event, a formal one, the kind that required her to be polished and composed and pleasant in a way that felt effortful even when she genuinely wanted to be all three of those things. There would be cameras. There would be crowds. There, TBH, would be people who wanted to see her smile and wave and perform the version of herself that the world expected, and she would do it, because she always did, because it mattered, and because she understood even at her age that the life she had come with obligations that were not optional. But something was wrong today. Something she couldn't quite put into words yet. It sat in her chest like a stone she'd swallowed accidentally. Small enough, TBH, to ignore, heavy enough to feel constantly. She'd been carrying it for a few days now, maybe longer if she was being honest with herself, which she was trying to be. It wasn't fear exactly. It wasn't sadness exactly. Plus, it was more like the feeling you get when you know something is about to shift and you can't see which direction it's going to fall. Like the moment before a storm, when the air goes strange and the birds stop singing and everything holds its breath. Charlotte was holding her breath. She didn't eat much at breakfast. Her mother noticed, Kate always noticed, but she didn't press, just refilled Charlotte's orange juice and touched the back of her hand briefly across the table, in that way she had, warm and light, saying everything without saying anything. Charlotte's father was on a call in the next room. She could hear the low murmur of his voice, not the words, just the rhythm of it, steady and reassuring the way his voice always was, and she held on to that sound for a moment the way you hold on to something familiar when the unfamiliar is pressing in. The motorcade, was scheduled for 10:30, which by 9:45, Charlotte was dressed and ready, standing in the front hallway with her hands folded in front of her, waiting with the particular patience that had been bred into her over years of public life, the patience of someone who has learned that being early is simply part of the job. Around her, staff moved with purpose. Security personnel stood at intervals, their posture perfect, their expressions professionally neutral, their eyes moving the way trained eyes do, scanning without seeming to, watching without appearing to stare. One of them was named James Calloway. He had been a Royal Protection Officer for 11 years. Before that, he had done 2 tours with the British Army, served in places that didn't make it into conversation at dinner parties, and come home carrying things that didn't make it into conversation anywhere. He was 38 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that was difficult to read because it had been trained that way, not cold, not hard, just still. Contained. Like a room with all the furniture pushed against the walls to make space for whatever needed to happen next. Calloway had been assigned to the princess's detail for just over 2 years. In that time, he had escorted her to more than 40 public engagements, stood at the perimeter of countless school events and official functions and private family gatherings that his security clearance allowed him to observe without participating in. He knew her schedule better than most people knew their own. He knew the way she moved through a crowd, always slightly toward the left when she was overwhelmed, always looking for her mother's face first and then her father's, always finding a way to engage genuinely with children who got close enough to speak to her even when the day had been long and the smiling had started to feel mechanical. He had also noticed, over the past several days, that something was off. It wasn't anything he could have documented in a report. Nothing he could have pointed to in a briefing. It was more for what it's worth, like a frequency shift, the same signal but at a slightly different pitch. She was quieter than usual, her eyes moved differently, checking things at angles she didn't normally check, holding on doorways and exits longer than the situation called for. She was still performing perfectly in public. But, honestly, performance was the key word. It used to look effortless. Plus, now it looked like work. Calloway noticed all of this the way he noticed everything silently, without making it anyone else's business until there was a reason to. This morning, standing in the hallway while the household prepared to move, he was watching her the way he always did, not obviously, not intrusively, from his position near the door. She was standing very still, her hands were folded. Her chin was slightly stepped in that way it got when she was concentrating on appearing calm. She looked composed. She looked fine. To anyone who didn't know what they were looking for, she was simply a well-mannered child waiting for her car. But her left thumb was pressing hard into the palm of her right hand. Hard enough that when she unfolded and refolded her hands a moment later, he could see the mark it had left. He didn't move, he didn't approach. He filed it, which the convoy moved at 10:32, 2 minutes behind schedule, which was unusual. The route had been confirmed twice, and the perimeter teams were in position. Charlotte sat in the back of the car next to her mother, and, from his position in the follow vehicle, Calloway couldn't see her face but he could see the back of her head and the rigid set of her shoulders, which hadn't relaxed the way they usually did once the palace gates closed behind them and the public face pressure lifted fractionally. They didn't relax today, which the event was at a children's hospital in central London. It was the kind of engagement that Charlotte genuinely liked. He knew this because he had watched her at enough of them to understand the difference between her real reactions and her performed ones. She was good with sick children. She was patient and curious and she got down to their level, literally, crouching beside beds or sitting on the floor without any self-consciousness, asking questions and meaning them. Today I think, though, even walking through the wards, even with the small patients reaching for her hand and the parents watching with the particular emotion that tended to fill rooms like that, she was moving through it all with something slightly wrong in the mechanism. Like a music box where the comb has one bent tine. Everything else plays, and plays correctly, but there's a note missing, and once you hear it missing you can't stop hearing the absence. Calloway stayed with his position. Watched. Did his job. Said nothing. It was in the third ward, during a break in the formal walkthrough, that it happened. The princess had stepped away from the main group just a few feet, just to a small alcove near a window where 2 nurses were chatting quietly and a tray of paper cups sat on a stand. Her protection officer from the primary detail, a woman named Graves, had adjusted her position accordingly. Calloway was covering the corridor. He wasn't supposed to be in earshot of the alcove. The acoustics of the hallway did something unexpected. He heard Charlotte say, very quietly, to no one in particular, or perhaps to the window, "I need someone to help me and I don't know who to ask." She didn't say it dramatically. She didn't say it with tears in her voice or any of the theatrical markers that would have made it easier to categorize and easier to dismiss. She said it the way you say something you've been carrying for so long that it's finally worked its way out of you without permission. Flat. Factual. I think, exhausted. Calloway stood very still in the corridor. Graves hadn't been in a position to hear it. Well, the nurses hadn't reacted. Charlotte was already straightening up, already pulling her expression back together, already turning to rejoin the group as though the moment hadn't happened, as though the words had never been spoken. But, sort of, they had been spoken. And, Calloway had heard them. He ran through protocol in his head the way he always did when something landed in the space between clear procedure and human judgment. His job was physical protection, which his job was the perimeter, the threat assessment, the body between the principal and the danger. His job wasn't to step into the emotional or personal space of a member of the royal family. There, I think, were people for that. There were structures for that. There were layers of support and staff and family and institution namely designed to handle everything that wasn't a security matter. He knew all of that. He also knew what he'd heard, and what it sounded like, and what 11 years of watching people under pressure had taught him to recognize. He didn't approach her in the ward. He didn't break position, didn't signal, didn't alter anything visible in his demeanor or his movement. He did his job through the rest of the engagement, stayed with his assignment, and kept his face exactly where it needed to be. But something had shifted in his understanding of this day. On the return journey, the convoy moved back through the same secured route. Charlotte was beside her mother again. Kate was well, talking to her softly. He could see the movement in her body language, attentive, gentle, leaning in. Charlotte's head was turned toward the window. The motorcade reached the palace at 14:21. Calloway completed the return sweep, signed off on his portion of the day's security log. Then, stood for a moment in the staff corridor outside the main wing, alone, the noise of the palace settling around him. The stone walls held the cold even in summer. The light came in at the specific angle it always came in at this time of day, hitting the floor in a long pale rectangle that stopped a foot short of the opposite wall. He thought about what he'd heard. He thought about the mark her thumb had left in her palm. He thought about the note that was missing from the music. And then, he made a decision that had nothing to do with protocol and everything to do with the kind of man he was when protocol ran out of answers. He was going to find a way to ask her if she was all right. Not as a security officer. Not through channels. Not in any way that could be logged or reported or turned into a conversation about his overreach or his position or the delicate boundaries between professional duty and human decency. He was going to find a moment, and he was going to ask her in the simplest way he knew how, and he was going to listen to whatever she said. He didn't know yet what she was going to tell him. He didn't know that it was going to change everything. He just knew, with the quiet certainty of someone who has learned to trust the thing in his chest that goes still when something matters, that it needed to be done. He straightened his jacket. He walked back down the corridor, which he went back to his post. And he waited for the right moment to arrive, the way he had learned to wait for everything, without rushing it, without forcing it, with the particular patience of a man who understood that the most important things always came when you stopped trying to make them happen and simply stayed present enough to meet them when they did. The palace moved around him. The day basically wound toward evening. Plus, the light in the corridor changed angle by angle until the long rectangle on the floor was gone entirely and the stone was just stone again, cold and quiet and holding everything it had ever been asked to hold. I mean, Charlotte was somewhere inside. Still composed, and still quiet. Still carrying whatever she was carrying. And Calloway was at his post. Watching. Waiting. Deciding, for the first time in 11 years of service, that there was something more important than staying inside the lines he had been given. He just hadn't figured out yet how to step outside them without everything falling apart. But he would. That much, he was sure of. 2 days passed before the moment arrived. In those 2 days, Calloway watched Charlotte move through her life the way he always watched her, from the correct distance, at the correct angle, with the correct expression on his face. He covered, in my opinion, 2 school pickups, 1 internal palace function, and a brief informal garden visit with her younger brother Louis that the family had arranged quietly to give the children some unstructured outdoor time away from anything official. He stood at his post. Plus, he filed his logs. He, to be fair, said nothing to anyone about what he had heard in that hospital corridor, because there wasn't a thing yet to say, and because saying the wrong thing too early was often more damaging than saying nothing at all. He had been in enough difficult situations to know that timing wasn't decoration. Timing was the whole thing. Charlotte, for her part, continued performing the version of herself that was expected of her. she was pleasant at the school pickup. Plus, she ran in the garden with Louis with what looked like genuine delight, or at least genuine enough that the household staff watching from the terrace smiled at each other, reassured. She ate her meals, and she did her homework. She appeared at the windows of the palace at the expected times and disappeared from them at the expected times and gave no visible indication to anyone that anything was wrong. Except for the thumb. He kept noticing the thumb pressing into the opposite palm. At breakfast once, where he could observe the tail end of the family's morning from his corridor position. At the garden visit, standing still for a moment between bursts of running with Louis, when she didn't think anyone was paying close attention. It was becoming a habit, the physical equivalent of a word someone keeps almost saying and then swallowing back down. He recognized it. He had done something similar for 3 years after he came home from his second tour. Not the thumb, in his case, and something else. The point wasn't the specific gesture. The point was what it meant when someone had a gesture like that, when the body keeps trying to release something the mind has decided to contain. On the third morning, the opportunity opened the way opportunities sometimes do, sideways, through a small gap in the ordinary structure of the day. Charlotte had a scheduled reading period in the library in the East Wing. This was a private time, no cameras, no staff beyond the one aide who typically sat with her and who, on this particular morning, had been called away briefly to handle a scheduling conflict that needed immediate attention. The protection detail covering the library had one officer positioned outside the main door and one Calloway covering the secondary access point at the far end of the corridor, which also happened to be closer to the library's side entrance. It was 7 minutes. He knew because he checked his watch when the aide left and checked it again when she came back. 7 minutes in which Charlotte was in the library alone with her book, the main door officer covering the primary approach, and Calloway at the secondary position with a sightline through the side entrance that most people would have considered to be covering his post and nothing else. He stepped inside. Not far, 3 feet inside the doorway. Enough to be visible, enough to be heard if he kept his voice low. Not well enough to be in the room in any way that could be misread by anyone who might walk in behind him, because he wasn't doing this wrong and he wasn't doing this carelessly, and if there was a line he was crossing here, he was crossing it with both eyes open and a clear account of exactly how far he was going. Charlotte looked up from her book. She had been sitting in the large chair by the window, the one she always chose when she had a choice, because the light there was good and because it faced away from the door, which meant she could have the illusion of being alone even when she wasn't. She looked at him with the exact expression she gave any adult who appeared unexpectedly in her space, measured, composed, slightly waiting. He said, quietly, "I apologize for stepping out of position, Your Royal Highness." "I won't be long." She waited. He kept his voice low and level. He said, "I heard something at the hospital. I wasn't trying to hear it. I was in the corridor and the acoustics were wrong." He paused. "I want to ask if you're all right. Not in the official way. Not in the way that goes anywhere. Just as a person asking another person." There was a silence in the library that had weight to it. The kind of silence that forms when something true has been said out loud and both parties are waiting to see what it does to the air around them. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. Her face had gone through something very quickly. He caught the edge of it, the flicker of surprise and then something else, something that looked like relief and also looked like caution, 2 things sitting in the same expression simultaneously, the way water can be clear and cold at the same time. She looked back down at her book. Then, she looked back up. She said, "You're going to get in trouble for this." "What's interesting is," he said, "I know." Another silence. Shorter this time. She said, "There's a girl at my school." He waited. He did not prompt. He did not nod encouragingly or make the sounds that people make when they want you to keep talking because they're invested in the story. He just waited, the way he had learned to wait, steadily and without pressure, because pressure closes things and he needed her to stay open if she had decided to be. She said the girl's name, and then she stopped for a moment as though deciding how much of the shape of the thing to show him. And then she told him. Plus, not all of it, not in a rush, but enough. The situation wasn't what he had braced for. He had been quietly prepared for something darker, something with a more serious architecture, because the way he had seen in her over those days had felt heavier than the thing she was describing. But the thing she was describing was real. It was real and it was complicated and it was the kind of situation that was almost worse for being medium-sized, too significant to ignore, too ambiguous to act on easily, existing in the gray zone between something that the adults around her would immediately know how to handle and something they would immediately know could be handled by adults. There was a girl in her class, a girl without Charlotte's resources or her name or her layer upon layer of institutional protection, who was being quietly, persistently, expertly made miserable by a group of 3 others. Not in the, to be fair, ways that got you sent to the headmistress. Well, not loudly. Plus, in the small constant ways that are harder to document and easier to dismiss and far more damaging for their lack of a clear incident anyone can point to. Exclusions. Looks, and the specific cruelty of being laughed at one beat after you've spoken, just enough that you can't quite prove the laugh was about you. Charlotte had been watching it for weeks. She had said something to a teacher once, carefully, framing it as a question rather than an accusation, and the teacher had said something vague and reassuring and then nothing had changed. She had tried talking to the girl directly and the girl had smiled and said everything was fine in the particular tone people use when everything isn't fine, but they've learned not to say so. She had kind of run out of things she knew how to do. And the reason she hadn't told her parents, this was the part that required Calloway to stand very still and not react, was that she had overheard enough in the careful way children overhear things in houses where important conversations happen in the next room, to know that her family was navigating something difficult at the institutional level right now. She had put together enough fragments of tone and timing and the specific silence that falls when adults realize a child has appeared at the wrong moment, to understand that this was a period when her parents were already carrying things. And she had made the decision on her own, at 10 years old, in the particular way of a child who has been watching adults manage difficulty her entire life and has internalized more than anyone realized, not to add to it. She had been trying to solve it herself. And she couldn't. And it had been sitting in her chest like a stone for 4 weeks. Calloway stood in the doorway of the library and listened to all of this, and when she was done he was quiet for a moment because some things deserve a moment of quiet before you respond to them. Then, he said, that was a good thing you tried to do. For yourself and for her. Charlotte looked at him in a way that suggested she had been prepared for several different responses, but not quite that one. He said, you didn't fail at it. You ran out of tools. Plus, those are different. She turned that over. He, could see her turning it over. He said, you shouldn't have to carry this alone. I know why you did. I understand the reason, and the reason is a good one. He paused. But, it's still too heavy for one person. She was quiet. Her hands, he noticed, were flat on the book in her lap. The thumb was still. He said, I can't fix this directly. That's not my position and it's not my place and you deserve someone better positioned to help than a protection officer who stepped 3 feet out of his corridor. He said it without apology in his voice, just plainly. But, I think you should tell your mother. Today, not later. Plus, I think she would want to know. Not gonna lie, Charlotte said, she's got enough. He said, she's got you. You're not a burden. You're her daughter. Those are different too. Another silence, and longer. He said, I've to go back to my position. The aide will be back in about 2 minutes. He looked at her directly. Are you going to be all right for the next few hours? She seemed slightly surprised by the question, not offended, just surprised, as though she hadn't expected him to account for the hours between now and whenever the harder thing happened. She said yes. He believed her. He said, good. I'll be in the corridor. He stepped back through the side entrance. He returned to his post. He stood where he was supposed to stand with his face where it was supposed to be and his hands where they were supposed to be, and the aide came back 40 seconds later and the world continued. What happened next wasn't immediate. These things rarely are, which he covered the afternoon's rotation and the evening handover and signed out at 18:45. He drove home the same route he always drove. He made dinner. He stood at his kitchen window eating it and watching the street below and thinking about nothing specific. The next morning he received a message through the internal palace communications system. It was from the personal secretary to the Princess of Wales, and it was brief and formal and said that a member of the household wished to thank him informally for a matter of personal service and that a time had been arranged for this to take place at his convenience. That was all it said. He read it twice. Then, he made his coffee. He stood at the kitchen window again, the same street, a different morning. Whatever Charlotte had done with the conversation in the library, she had done something. The conversation had moved. The weight had found somewhere to go. He didn't know yet what the consequences for him would be. He had stepped outside his position, which he had initiated a private conversation with a member of the royal family without authorization. He had made a judgment call that was entirely outside the scope of his assignment and that could, depending on how it was received, end 11 years of service in a single afternoon. He knew all of this. He also knew that the girl at Charlotte's school was, in some indirect way that he would never be able to trace or verify, slightly less alone today than she had been yesterday. And that Charlotte was slightly less alone. And that those two things were real regardless of what happened to his employment. He finished his coffee. He put on his jacket. He went back to the palace. He stood at his post. And he waited, again, with the same patience he always brought to waiting, for the next thing to arrive and tell him who he was going to have to be. The palace hummed around him the way it always did, enormous and quiet and full of lives being lived at a frequency most people never heard. He had been standing in the middle of it for 11 years and had grown so accustomed to its particular silence that he'd stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing the sound of a river after you've lived beside it long enough. He noticed it today, and he stood in his corridor, in his spot, with the light coming in at its usual angle, and he noticed the river sound of the palace and thought that some things you've to be standing right on the edge of losing before you can properly hear them. He was still at his post when the message came through that he was wanted upstairs. He straightened his jacket. He walked toward the staircase. Whatever was, I think, at the top of it, he was ready. The room he was brought to wasn't the formal receiving room. It wasn't the kind of room where institutional consequences got delivered. He knew the geography of those rooms the way he knew the geometry of every space he was responsible for protecting, their exits. Angles, their furniture arrangements, the way light distributed itself across their floors at different times of day. He knew which rooms in this building meant something pleasant was about to happen and which rooms meant something was being recorded for documentation purposes. This room was a sitting room on the second floor of the private wing. It was warm, which it had flowers on the side table, the informal kind, not the arranged formal kind, but the kind that looked like someone had picked them from somewhere and put them in a jug because they were nice. There was a sofa and 2 chairs and a low table with a tea tray that had already been poured. It was the kind of room where a family actually lived rather than received. Its being that kind of room told him more about what was happening before anyone said a single word. He stood just inside the doorway. He did not sit down, because no one had invited him to sit down, and because 11 years of professional conduct did not evaporate the moment you stepped into a room with warm flowers on the table. Kate came in for what it's worth, from the door at the far side. She was wearing something ordinary, not an engagement outfit, not a formal presentation, just clothes, the kind of clothes a mother wears at home on a morning that doesn't have a schedule attached to it. She looked like herself rather than like the public version of herself, and the difference, which was subtle and real and took a specific kind of attention to see, was that she walked into the room without the half-second of composition that always happened before she entered any space where she was being observed in an official capacity. She sat down in one of the chairs. She gestured to the other chair and said, "Please sit down." "Honestly," she said, "I'm going to speak to you without any of the usual framing because I think you'll find that more useful than the formal version." He said, "Of course." She said, "Charlotte spoke to me 2 evenings ago. She told me about the girl in her class, and she told me about the conversation she had with you in the library." He kept his expression level. He said, "I understand that I stepped outside my assignment. I want to say clearly that I know that and that I don't intend to use any justification that makes it sound like it wasn't a line I chose to cross." She looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who has prepared for a conversation to go in several directions and is recalibrating because the direction it has actually gone and wasn't on their list. She said, "That's a very careful thing to say." He said, "I meant it carefully." A pause. She looked at to be fair, the tea tray, she said, "Will you've tea?" He said yes. She poured, which they sat for a moment with their cups, which was one of the stranger situations he had been in during 11 years of strange situations, and then she set her cup down and said what she had actually brought him here to say. She said, "My daughter has been carrying something alone for a month. She decided not to tell me because she thought I had enough on my plate and she was trying to protect me from additional weight. She is 10 years old." She paused, which she told a palace security officer in a library side entrance because he noticed something was wrong and asked her in a way that felt safe enough to answer. She let that sit for a moment. He let it sit. She said, "I don't have a framework for that fits inside normal procedure. I'm aware of that. I'm also aware that if you hadn't stepped out of your corridor I might still not know what was happening with my own child, and that's..." She stopped briefly. "That's something I don't know how to finish that sentence without it sounding like it came from a place I'm not prepared to discuss in a meeting with an officer I've spoken to twice in 2 years. He understood. He said, "You don't have to finish it." She said, "No. I think I do." She looked at him directly in a way that was probably something she used when she was serious. Didn't want it to be miscalibrated by the person she was looking at. She said, "Thank you. For paying attention. For deciding that paying attention was worth the risk. And for doing it in a way that," she said, "didn't make her feel frightened or handled." She said she felt like someone was just asking. He said, "That was what I was trying to do. At least that's how I see it." She nodded. Then, she said, "I've spoken to the school. The situation with the girl in Charlotte's class is being dealt with directly and, specifically, not with the vague gestures that Charlotte had already tried. Someone is being made accountable. The girl has support coming to her from 2 directions now, through the school and through a private arrangement that Charlotte suggested herself, which was," a small pause, "a remarkably practical idea for someone who came to me with her hands shaking." He felt something move in his chest at that. He kept it off his face, which he said, she had been thinking about it for a long time. She'd already tried most of the obvious things. Kate said, "Yes." She had. She looked at the flowers on the side table for a moment. She said, "That's the part that stays with me." Basically, that she had tried. That she had thought it through. That she had made a decision about what to carry alone and what not to, and made it based on another brief stop, based on watching us. On knowing us well enough to decide she didn't want to add to our weight. He said nothing. This wasn't the kind of moment that needed anything added to it. She said, "I don't know how to raise a child who doesn't absorb this environment. I'm not sure it's possible when the environment is what it's. But I'd like her to know, and I'm working out how to give her this, that protecting me isn't her job. It has never been her job. She is a child and her job is to let me protect her, and if she can't always do that then I at least need her to know she can come to me when the carrying gets too heavy." He said, "She knows that now." Kate looked at him. She said, "Because of you." He said, "Because she decided to speak. I only made the opening." She was quiet for a moment. Then, she said, "Regarding your position, I've spoken with the head of the protection detail. I want to be clear with you about what's and isn't on the table." She straightened slightly. Back into the more structured register, which was its own kind of courtesy, giving him the information in the form that was easiest to receive and act on. "What you did was outside protocol. That is documented, I guess, and acknowledged. Though, the assessment of your superior and my own, for what my opinion is worth in personnel matters, which isn't as much as people assume, is that the outcome, the method, and the judgment you used in how you handled the situation reflects a kind of capacity that is uncommon and should not be punished out of the service." He said, "I understand." She said, "You'll receive a formal notation of the protocol breach in your file. That's not something I can prevent and into try, because the system needs to know what happened. But the notation pretty much will carry a full account of the context, and your record for the preceding 11 years will weigh appropriately. She paused. You won't lose your position. So yeah, he exhaled very slowly. He hadn't known until that moment how much he had been holding. She saw it, and she was good at seeing things. She said, simply, "Good, you know?" They had their tea. The conversation moved to smaller things. She asked him something practical about the transition in one of the security rotations, a real question with a real answer she wanted, and he gave it, and the room settled into a different kind of quiet. Not the charged kind, which the ordinary kind, the kind that falls when something that needed to be said has been said and the world has continued. He left the sitting room 22 minutes after he had arrived. He walked back down the staircase and through the corridor to his post. The light was at a different angle now. The long pale rectangle was back on the floor, just reaching the opposite wall and stopping where it always stopped. 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning, Charlotte appeared at the end of the corridor he was covering. She was in her school uniform. She was heading toward the side entrance where the car was waiting. She walked with two of her aides and she was talking to one of them about something he couldn't hear, and she looked, in the general assessment of her posture and her pace and the set of her face, lighter. In my opinion, that was the word. In my opinion, not happy exactly. Not obviously different in any way that would have been visible to someone who hadn't been cataloging the weight of her for the past 3 weeks. Just lighter. The stone in the chest thing, whatever it had been, had reduced. Not gone, he wasn't naive enough to think that 10-year-olds put things fully down that quickly, but reduced. Redistributed. Shared with someone who could help carry it. She passed him without slowing. She was still talking to the aide. And then, in I think, a half second as she moved past his position, she looked at him once. Direct. Brief. No smile. No performance. No version of herself for public consumption. Just a look that said, "I see you. You saw me." That happened and it was real. He gave her the smallest possible nod. Then, she was to be fair, past him, and the aides were past him, and the corridor was corridor again. He stood at his post. He had been, to be fair, a protection officer for 11 years. He had stood in more corridors than he could count. He had covered more events and routes and perimeters than he had ever bothered to catalog, because the job wasn't the counting of things. The doing of them over and over, with consistency and precision and the particular kind of dedication that comes from believing that what you're doing matters even when nothing dramatic is happening. He had never, in 11 years, stepped 3 feet out of his corridor to ask someone if they were all right. He thought about what it had cost him. The risk. The notation in his file, the 22 minutes in that room not knowing which way the conversation was going to fall. He thought about what it had cost Charlotte to say, "I need someone to help me and I don't know who to ask." To say that to a window, in a hospital corridor, with no expectation that anyone was close enough to hear. And he thought about what it was worth, not in any balance sheet way, not in the language of costs and outcomes and professional risk assessments. Just in the simple human way of worth. What it was worth, to one 10-year-old girl, that the person standing 3 feet outside her line of sight had been paying enough attention to hear what she almost hadn't said, and had cared enough to do something about it even knowing it might cost him something to do so. Look, he couldn't measure it. He didn't try. Plus, the school car had gone. The corridor was quiet. He had 4 more hours on his shift and then the handover and then the drive home and the kitchen window and the street below, ordinary and unchanged. He stood in it, he stood in the corridor with the light on the floor and the cold in the stone and the sound of the palace moving around him like a river, enormous and quiet, and he felt not proud, exactly. In my opinion, proud was too simple. He felt like someone who had spent 11 years learning to wait for the right moment, and had recognized the right moment when it arrived, and had moved. That was, for what it's worth, all it was. And it was enough. Plus, somewhere in the school car moving through central London, Charlotte was talking to her aide about something ordinary. The stone in her chest was smaller. The girl in her class wasn't going to have the same Tuesday she had been going to have, because 2 days ago someone had finally been made accountable. Something, for what it's worth, had shifted, and the quiet persistent cruelty had a wall in its way now where before there had been nothing. Sort of, these were real things. They were, look, small in the architecture of a palace and a royal family and an institution that had been standing for centuries. But they were real, and they had happened, and they would continue to have happened no matter what else changed around them. The light moved on the floor. Calloway stood at his post. He watched the empty corridor, the way he always watched it, steadily, without drama, with the complete and quiet attention of a man who understood that most of what mattered happened in the spaces between the things that seemed important. In the corridors. In the 7-minute gaps. In the 3 feet between where you were supposed to stand and where something needed you to be. He watched the empty corridor, and he was grateful for it. For the look, palace and the stone and the river sound and the particular angle of the light at this time of day. For 11 years of standing in places exactly like this one. For the training that had taught him to notice things, and the character that had taught him what to do with what he noticed. And for a 10-year-old girl who had said something to a window that she hadn't meant for anyone to hear, and a set of corridor acoustics that had been wrong in exactly the right way, and a moment that had opened sideways out of the ordinary structure of an ordinary day and asked him who he was going to be. He had answered. And the corridor was quiet, and the palace moved, and the stone held the cold. The way stone always does, and Calloway stood at his post, and the story went on.